The Transportation and Commerce Committee will now come to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Oldenburg.
I'm here.
That's a present.
Alderman Narayan. Alderwoman Schweitzer. Alderwoman Cox Antwi.
Present.
Chair Cone.
Present.
Alderman Narayan. Alderwoman Schweitzer. We have 3 present.
Wonderful. With that, we have a quorum to continue moving forward with the meeting for this morning. I believe we have the minutes from our Tuesday, July 1st meeting in front of us. We do. I will entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes.
So moved.
How was it? You got the motion
I move to approve the meeting minutes
from.
Second.
the July 1st meeting.
It's been moved by the Alderwoman from the 8th and seconded by the Alderman from the 2nd that we approve our meeting minutes from July 1st, 2025. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Aye.
Alderman Narayan. Alderwoman Schweitzer. Alderwoman Cox Antwi.
Aye.
Chair Cone.
Aye.
Alderman Narayan. Alderwoman Schweitzer. We have 3 aye votes.
With that, you sustain the motion of the Alderman from the 8th to approve the meeting minutes. Today's meeting, we actually don't have any board bills on the agenda, contrary to what I was hoping for, but there will be a TNC meeting likely next week to have a hearing on one of the board bills that will be introduced this Friday. With that, we do have with us a band of folks from the CVC that are going to give us a presentation this morning, including the new CEO of Explore St. Louis, Brad Dean. So Mr. Dean, if you wouldn't mind taking the stand before us and providing us with the context and background in the presentation for this morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Brad Dean, for EDC. Today I have with you 2 colleagues here, representing the team. We're working today on the busiest. And we appreciate the opportunity and share a brief update on visitor conference. And also a brief update. So we'll jump right in. We want to level set.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dean, but is your mic on? So we could barely hear you. Is that light green?
Oh, it's not. Yeah, if you could turn the mic.
Well, there we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Does that work? All right. So we've shifted our measurements of economic impact of travel and tourism on the St. Louis region using Oxford Economics and their tourism arm, Tourism Economics. This is a improved measure that we believe is better suited for St. Louis. It's used by dozens of states and regional tourism outlets all throughout the country. You can see on the screen here an economic impact in 2024 of about $4.5 billion. This is the St. Louis metro region. So we could surmise that the city impact is just a bit above $2 billion out of that 4.6. Full extended impact over $7 billion. Notable $1.1 billion of taxes generated through the visitor economy. That's everything from sales taxes, hotel taxes, property taxes, and otherwise. And perhaps most importantly, over 42,000 St. Louisans whose livelihood depends upon the health and vitality of the visitor economy. Notable for you, the hotel taxes for the past fiscal year, right at $9.4 million. And that's for, of course, fiscal year 2025, which includes part of 24 calendar year, part of 25 calendar year. Those numbers are more or less in line with the prior 2 years, a little bit above fiscal year 23, a little bit below fiscal year 24. I'm told that the variance between 24 and 25 might have to do with some late collections. So for all intents and purposes, it's been relatively flat for the last 2+ years. Notable that this is about 13% above pre-pandemic levels. So we are above pre-pandemic travel tourism levels, but kind of hanging as a bit of a plateau for the last couple of years. This gives us great confidence for 2025. The chart you're looking at now shows in the red the revenue per available room of hotels to St. Louis City and County as compared to the U.S. average and the top 25 markets in the U.S. Revenue per available room is a very important statistic for the hotel industry because it measures not only occupancy, the volume, it also measures the pricing. This would be the best indicator we have of hotel profitability through our region. This chart is a very encouraging chart, and it should make us feel very good compared to other regions. I will note, however, that our team has cautioned me that RevPAR does not always translate to tax growth in St. Louis, so we need to see what these numbers actually bear out in tax collections. But this comes from the largest aggregator of hotel statistics in the country, CoStar, and even if it's halfway right, it suggests that St. Louis has performed very well in comparison to our competition and the national average. And a big reason for that is this chart.
Mr. Dean, can I just point of clarification? You said the red is St. Louis City and St. Louis County, or is that just
correct?
Because the slide itself says St. Louis.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. That would be St. Louis City. I apologize. This chart here is St. Louis City.
Okay.
St. Louis City and County would actually be a little higher. So this is the city RevPAR. Thank you for that clarification. In comparison to national average and top 25 markets.
Okay. Thank you.
Big reason for that growth is this chart, and this shows the number of consumed room nights from convention business. And most of this, obviously, in the city, a little bit would lean into the county. This is just St. Louis, and this is for several years, and you can see that 2025 has been a really good year for the meetings and convention business. And that not only drives volume, that drives rate, and that has a lot to do with that prior chart where you see the revenue per available room growing. So all of this is to say that we've had a couple of years of flat performance, but 2025 trending upward in large part because of the group business. So looking ahead, what do we see? And I would love to come before the Board of Alders and tell you that the outlook for the next couple of years is bright and sunny, but that wouldn't be honest. The reality is that there's some challenges on the horizon, and we're going to begin feeling those pretty quickly. The forecasts coming from the same economists that gave us the economic impact suggest, as you can see here, that we could see a bit of decline next year. Let me preface this by saying we're not satisfied with this, we're not accepting this, and we're certainly not going to sit back and watch this happen without taking every action we can take to correct this. But as the forecast stands today for calendar year 2026, our region is projected to see a bit of a decline as compared to very, very modest growth throughout the U.S. A big part of the reason for this projected decline is this chart. And I know this gets a little busy and the numbers might be a bit too small to be able to pull off from where you're sitting, but let me make it very simple for you. This chart shows the projected group room nights on the books today for the next 4 years. Green is what's on the books for 2025 and then each subsequent year, so 26, 27, 28, 20. Naturally, the numbers go down a little bit each year because we're getting farther and farther out. Bear in mind, most meetings and conventions book 3 to 5 years in advance. So when you look at each of these years, you can see the blue, which is where we were at a year ago, and the red where we were at 2 years ago. It kind of gives you what we like to call a pace. And you can see that the pace in 2026 and 2027 is worrisome. Various reasons for this. I won't come here today suggesting I have all the answers because I haven't been here very long. What I can tell you is that as meetings and conventions go, we've got our work cut out for us for the next 2 years. And because most meetings book 3 years then out, very limited amount of business that we can actually book, particularly in the year for the. As we get into 28 and 29, we're faring better. So the question before us is, what can we do to help course correct for the next 2 years?
Can you, just going back to that slide, so the STLY and the STL, is that 2 or Z?
That's 2. So that is,
2 years out.
what you're looking at is STLY is St. Louis last year, and STL2Y would be St. Louis 2 years
2
ago.
years, yeah.
So it's a good question. I want to make sure that I'm speaking clear so you and your constituents understand what we're looking at. And this is particularly important because this tells us, are we pacing well? Are we preparing well for the future? Or do we have some softness in the calendar that needs to be addressed? So if you look at that, well, let's just look at the middle 3 columns, and that's 2027. You can see that green compared to red, we have about half the rooms on the books for 2027 as we would have been pacing 2 years ago or 2 years out. That's very troubling. And think about the extended impact of that. If you're a hotel and you depend on meetings and convention business and you're seeing a soft calendar, you're starting to adjust prices downward, which of course affects the economy and affects tax collectors. You're starting to think twice about, do I add that new job? Do I invest in the property? And this is really just focused on the hotels that take in consumer or group business. Well, that has a negative impact on the smaller hotels that feed off of the consumer traffic, because now it's going to get much more competitive. So when we look at 26 and 27, it is not a good outlook, and we know that has extended impact all throughout the economy.
So am I reading this correctly, though? If on the books would be current year, so that first set of columns, I can't read the numbers from here, my apologies, but it's somewhere around 300,000.
Correct.
The next set of columns, though, has last year at like 250,000, meaning 25, comparing 25 to 25. What's the difference between the green and the blue? So on the books for this year, 2025, and the blue STL last year for 2025.
Yeah, so looking at those first 3 columns.
The 2 sets of columns. So I wish I had like a little clicker here, but
Because it looks like in the second set of columns, Shane, if I'm understanding you correctly, 2025 had around 300,000, but the green
I
in
got
the
you.
first column
Yeah.
is slightly
So
higher.
each green column is what's on the books now for that year. The blue is what was on the books for that same time period, but not the same year. So every one of these is looking a year and 2 years out. So what this is telling us, if you look at the second group of columns, there, the first frowning face, that blue would have been a year out from that particular from that measurement. So we were looking at 2026. You'd be looking at a year out of a year ago, which would have been looking at 2025. Well, that one you're pointing at the blue column there. That was this year we're in now. Yeah. Correct. A year ago. That blue is, see how the blue you're pointing to in the second group has gone up a little bit when you look at the green in the first column. The blue is a year out, and the red is 2 years out in any given year. So it's telling you how were we pacing a year ago.
But it's the pace of the projections
Correct.
at the time.
Correct.
Okay.
This is an actual calendar. Oh, thank you, Aura. So this green column is actual on the book 2025.
Correct.
This is projected for 2026, what the on the book for 2025.
Blue that you're pointing to is what was on the books for this year a year ago.
Okay, all right, thank you for that clarification.
And I know this is color-coded nausea for you right now, but I share this for two reasons. One, I don't think you need the head of the CVC to come up here and tell you that it's all rainbows and sunshine when it's not. Secondly, while I realize this is a deep dive into meetings and convention monitoring, this is precisely the kind of data-driven approach that you should expect out of your CVC, and this is exactly what we have to do to guide our sales and promotions. So getting back to the point at hand, knowing the next 2 years are not going to be great years for the meetings and convention business, what do we do to course correct? What do we do to turn this into a better situation than that forecast projects? One of the opportunities is in 2026, we have a number of events that are unique to this year, each of which build an opportunity for us to bring not only more visitors to the region, but more new visitors, first-time visitors to St. Louis. Bless you. The first two, you'll notice, the U.S. Figure Skating is an event that the St. Louis Sports Commission has worked diligently to bring. That's a great event that brings national and international exposure, and it will occur in a time that's typically pretty slow. So we'll have a lot of first-time visitors coming to St. Louis, and it gives us an opportunity to showcase ourselves on the national and international stage. The next one is an exciting event. This is the return of Global Robotics to St. Louis Robotics Conference, which is a global robotics competition. It will bring students from every state and territory of the U.S., as well as dozens of countries. They'll be competing not too far from here at the Americas Center in a global robotics conference. We anticipate they and their parents and families will be wandering all throughout the St. Louis region and hopefully visiting some college campuses while they're here as well. Of course, the centennial of Route 66 and as well America's 250th give us great opportunities for events and tapping into the hype around both of those important milestones. And then a little soccer tournament called the FIFA World Cup that I'm sure you're familiar with. While the competition itself is not happening here, we're hopeful that one or two venues in St. Louis could be a base camp site, which will bring players, coaches, families, and visitors here. And you think about the time between matches, there'll be a lot of travel for those who are coming for a FIFA competition and then expanding out. In fact, Brand USA, which is the national counterpart of Explore St. Louis, projects that the average FIFA visitor will visit at least 5 U.S. cities. So if they're in Kansas City for the Cup, they can come here for the fun, and that's just a train ride away. So we're not giving up on 2026, but as our Chief Commercial Officer likes to tell our team, next year is going to have to be the year of leisure travel. We're going to have to make up that dour forecast on meetings and conventions with increased leisure travel.
Have you, I'm sorry, with the FIFA World Cup, have there been communications with like Amtrak and with the airports just to see if they've already seen an uptick in the number of bookings for into St. Louis because of or possibly because of, I don't know if they know exactly why people are booking, but just to see if there's any correlation between the World Cup being in Kansas City and, you know, an uptick in travel for leisure to St. Louis on either Amtrak or any of the airlines.
No uptick yet, but take that as nothing to mean other than just people don't know where they're going yet. I think on December 5th is when they actually announce who will play where. Once the teams are announced and they know who's playing in Kansas City versus who's playing in Boston and elsewhere, then we'll start to see the bookings. I suspect that Amtrak thinks that there's going to be a lot of travel because they've added another route between Kansas City and St. Louis. So we're certainly counting on taking advantage of it. But I'd be less than honest if I told you there's an uptick now. In fact, the hotels I've spoken to, not just in St. Louis, but nationwide, are eagerly, perhaps anxiously awaiting to see that booking. I mean, we're talking about millions of people coming here for one of the biggest sporting events ever in the United States, but it's all going to happen in a period of weeks and months. And so, key point, we want to make sure St. Louis is not left out of that. While we're not a World Cup site, we can be a great venue for World Cup visitors.
On a similar vein, how do you, I'm assuming this activity was not in the projected numbers we saw before because they're not meeting in convention with their leisure. How do you forecast the activity, as Shane mentioned, talking to like maybe the travel departments or other hotels to see if we're actually getting traffic from?
Yeah, great question. So a couple things we'll do. First is we're working with our airline partners. And as you're well aware, we have expanded service coming via Lufthansa and British Airways. They will see that before anybody, because first thing you do is buy your tickets. Second thing you're going to do is buy your airfare. So we're making sure that our plans for 2026 address the opportunities there. Secondly, this is one of those rare instances where we work collaboratively with other destinations. So in this case, Kansas City and us might be competing for meetings from time to time. In this case, Kansas City wants the visitors to have a great experience. So we've been working closely with the State Department of Tourism, as well as our friends in Kansas City, to project booking levels, what we can then adapt to. So for example, let's say the team from Germany or the team from the UK are playing in Kansas City. That's a great opportunity for a multi-destination message and platform and program. And then the other thing is we'll be looking at some of the tools I'll touch on in a minute that will allow us to see where bookings are happening and when. And then we can start to dive into those details to see where we're pulling from. Not to say that we'll only get German visitors if the German team's playing here in Kansas City. We'll see them from all over. But we'll be able to decipher what is booking and what's working. This next chart, while it's pretty dour in terms of its findings, I see more than a glimmer of opportunity here. This chart comes from Longwoods International, which is one of the preeminent travel trackers in the country. They track a number of facets of travel tourism. And you can see here the data is pretty clear that the government shutdown has impacted travel substantially. And the economic uncertainties that we face this year and looking into next year certainly hinder travel in some respects. That's the downside. The upside is I see this as an opportunity for our region. Now, I tend to be a glass half full guy anyway, but in this case, you think about St. Louis in the midst of an economic uncertainty, and while the government shutdown has ended, you know better than anybody that the impact has not been fully felt by everybody. There's an extended impact for citizens here as well as throughout our region and our country. When economic slowdowns happen, travel doesn't necessarily stop, but people will travel less frequently, they'll shorten their stays, they will reduce their expenditures, they will look for any way they can continue to travel and just spend less. So, being a market that's easily accessible by rail, by air, and by automobile, being a market that is extremely affordable, and one that offers an abundance of free attractions as well as very affordable attractions, I think arguably fares well in times of economic uncertainty. In fact, that may be part of the lift that we saw when I showed you those good RevPAR numbers earlier. So when we think about 2026, yes, meetings and conventions will not be great for us. It will be a less than stellar year. Doesn't mean that we can't fill more hotel rooms and restaurants and attractions by attracting more visitors, whether they're here for a one-time event like FIFA or America's 250th, or we're just a better choice because you're looking to save a little, but still enjoy a great travel experience. So how do we do that? We've got to make some tweaks to our plan, and we've got to make some adjustments to our strategy. And so 2026 is really a year of building forward together. The first thing that we've done over the past few months to prepare ourselves for this is to take a deep dive into your CVC. Look at what we do, how we do it, what's working, what's not working, what's missing, and what are those things that we can just stop doing because they just don't work very well. A number of mentioned here on the screen, we have evaluated whether or not we qualify for accreditation, which just tells us the basic standards that we're operating at as a travel, tourism, meeting, and convention promoter. We have taken a deep dive into our digital marketing strategies, not just looking at how we compare to ourselves versus last year pre-pandemic, not simply looking at how we compare to Kansas City or Indianapolis, but we invited the consultants doing these reviews to compare us to the best in the industry. We think St. Louis deserves the best. I think the city and the region is too good not to be great. We have to operate at a very high level. We invited an expert to come in and evaluate how we're managing, leading, and strategizing the St. Louis Film Office, which is a part of the CVC. We're looking at how we manage the facilities and in particular studying the revenue potential of the Dome in light of our current strategies of utilization, as well as doing a number of internal organizational assessments and gathering a lot of feedback. In fact, that feedback is extensive enough that we've initiated a resident sentiment study for residents of St. Louis City and County, what they think of the CVC, what they think of our industry, what are the gaps that we should be filling. We've done a number of stakeholder interviews and over 700 surveys of local stakeholders. We've held focus groups, everything from hotels in the city to restaurants to attractions to young leaders in their 20s and 30s to political operatives that work in the political arena that you're very familiar with, trying to get a grounded base on how people view our organization, our future, and particularly the role of the visitor economy in St. Louis. And then we've also just recently conducted a listening session with dozens of local stakeholders. All told, all of this will encompass the views, the perspectives, the ideas, and suggestions of over 2,000 St. Louis over a period of a few months. In fact, I should mention that each member of the Board of Aldermen and Alderwomen have been invited to participate in interviews, and if they haven't received that invitation or haven't been able to schedule that, please let me or my assistant know. We would love to get the perspective of each board member. All of this is really intended to just put an ear to what the community expects and needs out of its CVC. And out of that will come feedback that will inform our strategies, our structure, and our priorities going forward. This year, operating in a challenging environment, we made sure that the budget was balanced. We need to assure you and our industry and our stakeholders and our community that we're not spending more than we're taking in. And we prioritize some budget adjustments with 4 simple criteria. Does it increase visitation? Does it strengthen the brand? Does it increase community collaboration and partnerships that are important to the visitor economy? And does it have a measurable impact? That last one's important because of the premise that if you can't measure it, it's pretty hard to manage it. And so this is what's guided this year's investment and the investment leading into 2026. And it's important that we frame this in light of what our industry needs and expects, because we can't do this alone. In fact, if we're going to succeed over the next couple of years in turning that negative forecast into positive, collaboration is going to have to be key. The chart you see on the screen is an interesting one that I think speaks to the challenge that St. Louis faces going forward. If we look at what we're investing, promoting the St. Louis region, and divide that amongst the different hotel rooms that we have to fill, essentially dollars per room, you can see how we compare to 3 other destinations that we often compete with: Indianapolis, Columbus, and Nashville. And simply put, we're not bringing quite as much to market as they are. Various reasons for that. I won't get into those details today unless you're really interested. But I'll put it in perspective that each of you can appreciate, because each of you have run successful campaigns and will probably run another campaign in the future. Imagine if you're going into the election period and your opponent is spending 2 or 3 times what you. Doesn't mean that money always wins, but if you're going up against an opponent that's outspending you 3 to 1, you know you're either going to have to outwork them or outsmart them. I take confidence in hearing that the chairman ran a pretty effective campaign with a limited amount of resources. So we've got to do in 2026 what you all have been able to do, and that is get your message out there and do it in a way that resonates with your constituents, and in our case, with potential visitors. So this is not a sorrowful story. This is just a fact that we know we've got to outwork and outsmart the competition if we're going to turn 2026 and 2027 into positive years. One of the ways we'll do that is really leaning heavy into digital promotion. That's not new. We've been doing that for a number of years, but we will be more focused on digital promotion next year simply because of the economies of scale and the fact that it helps us reach audiences that we're not currently reaching often enough now. And that leads to this chart, which emphasizes a key change that we have just made over the past few months. We're seeing success, and we're hopeful to see continued success in 26, and that is leaning into some new markets, markets that we haven't consistently had a presence in, markets that we believe offer great opportunity because they offer affordable, nonstop flights. So we won't just be focusing our advertising in our backyard. Places like Denver, Minneapolis, Houston, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., where there's high disposable income and a high propensity to travel. It's a little bit of an opportunity and challenge. The challenge is they're not typically thinking of St. Louis in these markets. The good news is they aren't predisposed with negative impressions of St. Louis. As the old line in Dorian Gray would say, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And our challenge is to go into these markets and get them talking about us. And of course, that includes London, Ireland, and Frankfurt, where we have the additional capacity coming next year. I've made it a point to emphasize the challenge in the group market, but don't take that to mean that we've given up. We will be attacking the meetings and convention market relentlessly with a revised and enhanced strategy. We will be using a hyper-targeted digital campaign focusing on those planners who do book within a 2-year period. Most meetings are booking farther out, but there are planners that will be booking, particularly those that might be looking at a destination like a Kansas City or a Dallas, where they'll be consumed with a lot of FIFA visitors, reconstruction and expansion of convention centers, opportunities to shift business. We'll be leveraging key partnerships of groups like ASAE and MPI that have committed to bringing big industry meetings here, using those as marketing network opportunities. We'll be working to grow local participation in new sales activations. We've refreshed and enhanced our presence at industry events. We are in the midst of rebuilding our sales team and realigning it more on industry verticals and less on geography. And specifically, we've strengthened our footprint in the DC and Chicago markets, which are important because that's where most association leaders are based. And if we're going to grow our presence in the association business, we need to have a presence there. And if there is one slide that I hope you take away, if there's one slide that gives me hope for the next couple of years and beyond, it's this one. A lot of numbers and colors. I'll just make it simple. Green is good, red is bad, and yellow and orange are kind of mediocre. And what you're looking on the screen before you is an evaluation of brand attributes where visitors and prospective visitors rank St. Louis. And what you can note here is a few things. First and foremost, the single most powerful and brand attribute that resonates the highest is dining. It's interesting to me as a new resident of the city how often St. Louisans approach our describing our community almost with a bit of an apology, a tad too much humility, if you will. I've often heard people say, well, we're not a foodie city like Chicago or New York, but we have great restaurants. That does not line up with the research. The research tells us that, according to our visitors, we are a foodie capital. You can tell a lot about a city by the food on its plate, and our food is abundant, it's delicious, and it's affordable. And dining ranks very high, in fact, at the top of the list. So we can lean into that as we try to attract more visitors and different visitors. You'll also notice as you lean down into that list that art, history, culture, and music rank very high. In fact, as high or higher than sports. We know we're a sports city, but our visitors tell us, yeah, but you got a lot more than sports. Art, history, culture, and music resonate. And maybe the most important stat on here, the one that gives me the most excitement and a bit of intrigue, is the left column. That's how the younger generation of travelers view St. Louis in comparison to my generation and other generations. There's something special, something powerful, arguably something magical about what's happening with the younger generation who are coming here. Now, demographers like Ness Sandoval can speak far more intelligently than I can about trends of relocation. What I can tell you is this: the younger generation of travelers love St. Louis. And to the degree that we can penetrate that generation of travelers and get them in their 20s and 30s, and then get them when they're married or have children, become professionals, want to start a business, maybe go to college, that can be a generational lift for St. Louis. And so while we are facing a couple of challenging years, when I look at this and I compare this to the stats that we saw previously, where we know there's clearly some opportunities to expand and enhance our message and our presence, I think there's an opportunity here to lean into this and really reposition St. Louis as a premier vacation destination, particularly for travels in the Midwest that are looking for art, history, culture, music, and sports, and want a great dining experience. I also want to assure you that we're going to do everything we can to position the meetings and convention market for future growth. The chart that before you doesn't really help us a lot for the next 2 years, but it does lay the foundation for, we think, what will be an improved strategy going forward. What we've listed on the screen for you are the various segments of meeting and convention business that rank at the top of our competitors list. This is where our competitors are focusing their time and their efforts. And the yellow shaded lines are those where we perform pretty well. So a couple of observations. Those three categories shaded in yellow, education, religious, and sports, make up about 80% of our meetings, convention, group business. That's 4 out of 5 rooms that we're bringing to St. Louis. They represent about 35% of our competitors. So we are over-indexing in religious, sports, and education business. If you look at those first 2 categories, you get into professional, science, and technology, and that includes a lot of association business. And then you look at the second category, health and medical. Those are about 35% of our competitors' portfolio, and it's about 8% of ours. So we're over-indexing in education, sports, and religious. Means we're very competitive. Not that we don't want that business, we want it, but we need and we want more in those top 2 categories. If you're anywhere near downtown this week, you'll notice the Supercomputing 25 conference. This is a high-spending audience that are going to be spending in restaurants, in bars, and clubs, and retail all throughout St. Louis. That's precisely the kind of business that we want to attract more of. So we've got to find a strategy that allows us to maintain that strength while capitalizing upon those 2 areas that right now are only 8% of our business, but could be 10, 15, 20% of our business going forward. And that will be a strategic imperative for the CVC going forward. So just wrap up with saying that we're focusing on a number of accountability measures that will make us more accountable to our industry, our community, and our stakeholders, including you. You will notice we will be using in 2026 a new ad attribution model, which will tell us how our advertisements are performing by market and by segment, and most importantly, throughout the year, not just an annual study that is not actionable month to month. We'll also be using strategic modeling of visitation trends. I shared with you some of the brand attributes. We'll take the next level of study in that. We'll be using quarterly forecasts to be able to adapt our marketing instead of just an annual forecast that tells us what someone projects for next year. I shared with you earlier the annual forecast, which shows us to be slightly below the national average. That's not actionable. So we've got to have a quarterly forecast that tells us what's happening over the next 30, 60, 90 days so that we can shift and adapt our marketing in a timely fashion. We'll also be using performance metrics versus our competition. A lot of the performance metrics we've used to date have been simply about prior year. I shared with you the color-coded chart on the meetings convention pace. That was comparing St. Louis to St. Louis over a period of years. We're using that same data accumulation, but looking at our competitors. How are they pacing in 27 and 28? And how do we compare to them, both in terms of lead generation and conversion rates? And then we'll also be conducting 2 studies that we've not used in the past, a resident sentiment study and a HALO study. Happy to unpack those for you at any time, but those give us an idea of how we're performing outside of our organization. A number of strategic objectives that we're focused on both in the current fiscal year, but we'll also be prioritizing in our next budget, improving brand health, optimizing the utilization of the 2 facilities we manage, the Americas Center and the Dome, a measurable return on investment, both for industry and government. My intent is that when we come before you in the future, we'll be able to tell you and your constituents precisely what the return on investment is, both for the taxes that have been invested and for the larger, broader economy. If we can't get you a 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 return on investment, then they've hired the wrong guy at the CVC. That'll be our goal, and that'll be independent, verifiable information that you'll be able to chart and see how your CVC is performing relative to the economy and to our competition. And we're targeting a higher level of meetings and conventions, in part because of the chart I just shared with you, where we'll really be focused on some segments that we're underperforming in now, with the goal that we're booking over 300,000 room nights a year through the Americas Center. And all of this only matters if it translates to job growth for St. Louis. So we will make sure that jobs generated are also a factor in our measurements going forward. What you can expect is transparency. I hope today that this presentation leaves you with at least one example of what I mean by that. You don't need me coming here telling you everything's fine when it's not. And I don't think we serve our community well by candy coating the truth. And I know that the media will have their own take on that, so we'll see how that gets reported. But I think we owe it to you and your constituents and our partners all throughout the visitor economy to be honest about what's working and what's not working. That also means we have to communicate regularly and effectively with our community and we have to hold ourselves accountable for return on investment. And we've got to be experts at collaboration, particularly when it comes to working with local organizations. You think about the chart that emphasizes the power and the potential in our arts, history, and culture. That only takes shape if we're good at working with those in the community that are putting forth the art, the history, and the culture, the artists, the artistry, the institutions that carry that. Mr. Chairman, if you'll afford me just a couple more minutes, I do want to leave you with a quick update of the America Center expansion. I'm new to St. Louis, but one thing it didn't take me long to figure out is that the Board of Aldermen and Alderwomen, the Mayor's office, the Comptroller's office played an absolutely vital and essential role to the expansion. It wouldn't have happened were it not for the leadership, and I gather it was not an easy process to get through. And so I think we owe you an update on where we're at with that. We are to date 86% spent on the investments that were made. Hall 4X, the big expansion in the convention center, is in use with supporting infrastructure around it. Modern lighting has been installed and in use. That was both aesthetics, but also a safety issue, much better lit. In fact, comparing the old and new, you feel like you're walking into a surgical outfit. Much brighter and much better lit. And recently, the coordination team appointed by Mayor Spencer met to approve 2 projects that had already been encompassed in the plan. It just had not been let out. And that is the upgrades to the Washington Avenue entrance and the adjoining parcel on 9th and Locust, which will be paved and fenced. That Washington Avenue entrance will happen next year, right about the same time the improvements on Washington Avenue with the traffic management. I think they're going to 1 lane. They're adding some, I think a median and maybe some planters in and around there. So that will happen on Washington Avenue, and then the entrance will be upgraded as well with a much more modern entrance and digital signage. We do have some remaining priorities for the funds that have not been invested. Those have been shared with the coordination team. Some of those encompass safety enhancements. Some are for the visitor enhancements. Some are just replacing infrastructure that's long overdue for replacement, like a generator. The 2 things that didn't happen, I think you're well aware of this, are the kitchen modernization and the ballroom. We're feeling that pinch right now this week, where we're running food up from the basement of the America Center, and when the elevator's not working, it wasn't a couple days ago, that puts an added challenge onto the team to deliver the kind of service that we expect. So I mention this only to let you know that it is a conversation we'll have to have at some point in the future. I realize this is not for today, may not be for this term, but at some point, we'll take the initiative to initiate those conversations about how do we modernize the kitchen operation and what do we do to make ourselves more competitive given the limited ballroom space we have. You're probably also aware that the RSA received funds from the RAM settlement. Those funds have been earmarked for improvements to the dome. Those are everything from mechanical to audiovisual to technology, some of which enhance safety, most of which enhance guest experience. $70 million does not fix the challenges of the dome, but it certainly will take steps forward in terms of delivering an experience there. Those funds have been prioritized over a 3-year plan, and we are working closely with the board of the RSA to initiate those. I believe a couple are already underway as we speak. So again, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for your partnership. Thank you for the time today. As a new resident of St. Louis, I also want to say thank you for your leadership and what you do for those of us who live in the city. We appreciate the opportunity to serve your constituents and our partners all throughout the region. I look forward to turning a couple of challenging years into good years and building upon the success that you and others have laid to ensure that our visitor economy continues to grow and that the best days of St. Louis lie before us and not behind us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I do want to just offer a couple points of, I don't think clarification, but just to make sure that it's on the record. So the former CEO, whenever she would talk about the improvements at America Center, always made sure that this body is reminded that we own the convention center. The city, it's a city asset that is owned by the city. we are responsible for paying for the improvements of the convention center. We do not own the dome. That's the RSA, but we do own the convention. And I'm only saying this as well because we do have a new member here who's freshly in office. So just for some context, when we're talking about the convention center itself, that is money that the city is obligated to put into that facility. It's a city-owned facility. The improvements that the CEO just, went through, we did have some collaboration with St. Louis County with funding for those improvements, partly because it is a regional tool, but it is a city asset. And so, any improvements there need to be approved by this body in order to make happen. But the CVC graciously manages it for the city and makes sure that we get our full use out of the facility. So just a point of interest. I have quite a few questions that I've written down, so if you'll indulge me. Can you maybe share a little bit more about, you mentioned it very briefly, but the St. Louis Film Office, it's a fairly newly established office over at the CBC. Can you just give us an update on how that came into, because some people might not even know that we have the St. Louis Film Office now, but how that came into being, what the process is, and what results we've seen from that since it was established, I think, 2 years ago now.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked because it's probably one of the least known or recognized parts of the CVC's role, and I think this is a great example of where the community was proactive. As I understand it, there was a period of time where the state of Missouri had either ceased or reduced their film incentives, and the reality is without an incentive package, you just can't attract broadcast production in the film and TV industry. They go where the money is available. The good news is their incentives usually only get paid if they're actually producing economic impact. So it's a unique segment of the economy, but it hits restaurants, hotels, all kinds of support. In some cases, it's local businesses. In some cases, it's just entrepreneurs that sign on. And so when the state reenacted its film tax credit, which is a pretty competitive package, it's not the highest in the nation, it's certainly not the lowest, it's competitive. St. Louis acted by creating a film office, which operates underneath the CVC. We have a full-time employee that runs that office. She reports into our chief commercial officer, who's here with me today, and her charge is to really be of service to constituencies, those outside of St. Louis that are going to produce films, movies, episodic TV, could also be commercials. And so what do they need? Oftentimes they need connections. They may need a connection at the city. They may need help with permitting. They may need hotels or restaurants. So part of her job is to serve their needs as a connector, if you will, but also to serve as a liaison for all of those entrepreneurs and businesses here throughout the region who want to be a part of that. So we become more a servant to those two constituencies. And as you saw recently, Soul on Fire is a great example. That film, which is an extraordinary story and a St. Louis story, would have been filmed in Canada, but for the film tax credit. But just deciding you're going to film in St. Louis, now you have all kinds of questions. Who do we work with? Where do we go? How do we get this done? How do we get that done? I will say in the review that we've done recently, which I mentioned, St. Louis's permitting is a competitive advantage. This is an easier place to get permitted than a lot of other cities and regions. So that's a competitive advantage that we'll use as we market the film office. This is a unique part of the CVC. It's not booking meetings and conventions. It's not convincing travelers to come on vacation. It's really trying to convince and serve and assist those who want to bring production here, which has a direct economic impact. But when you think about a movie like Soul on Fire, it tells the St. Louis story in a way that we couldn't tell with paid advertising. So it's a good marketing extension that has a direct economic impact. We're going to tighten up the strategy and really focus on what are our core advantages as we grow that in 2026.
I personally was very disappointed when the state discontinued the tax credit program. I mean, that was probably the better part of a decade ago. I remember Kim Tucci, who is, a luminary in, the St. Louis tourism business here, was very much an advocate for that down in Jefferson City, and had many conversations after they discontinued the program. And so I'm happy that it's back. I'm happy that we've got a film office established that's utilizing that program and helping. And I'm really ecstatic to hear that St. Louis has some of the easiest permitting processes in the country. That's the first I've ever heard that. I've never heard that before. So it's nice to know that some folks find it easy to do business here. Obviously, they're not working through the city's departments in terms of the building division, forestry division, but we'll get there, I'm sure.
Can I be on record as saying the permitting was easy? We could make sure we own that.
That's exciting news. But I think the feedback that I get from folks is around, even programming like, an easy one, Bravo has like Top Chef or like, other competitive programs where they'll end up in food cities. And St. Louis, has a direct connection to Bravo TV. One of their presidents is a native, and I believe we've used him in advertising through the CB before. So it seems that that might be a natural connection to be able to bring that type of programming to St. Louis as well. And while it's not a direct connection to tourism, it does help to enhance our brand and reinforce some of those data points that you were just talking about earlier in terms of, food was one of the top, commodities from a tourism perspective in terms of what attracts people to St. Louis or enjoy St. Louis here. And so, I think being able to use the film office in some capacity to be able to talk about, some of the television programming or, streaming programming that happens. One of the programs that was extremely popular a couple of years ago before the tax credits got reenacted was Ozark. I mean, it literally happened in our backyard. And none of it was filmed in Missouri. It was all filmed in Georgia, which is just absolutely wild to think about. There was an extremely popular, successful program that was about the state of Missouri that also had, some connections to St. Louis as well. None of it was filmed anywhere in the state. I mean, it was just absolutely ridiculous. So I'm glad that we're in a place where we're able to bring that type of business here, reap the benefits of it and also support the local economy, but also hopefully get involved with programming that would help to reinforce some of the data points that we're already seeing as well.
I think you have just perfectly summarized exactly the strategy that we have to follow. And it's a two-part strategy. There's the economic impact. We want to go after that. We want to be able to boost the economy in the short term with production. But not all production is a brand lift. If it's a TV commercial, unless it's got the arch in there, it may not be recognizable in St. Louis, but it's still going to keep locals employed, and we want that. But where we've got to get to, and I think that's our next level, and that's one of the reasons why we brought an expert in, is to look at how does St. Louis shine? What brand attributes shine here? And how do we partner with local institutions and individuals to help us elevate that and make those connections? Dining would be an obvious one. It was interesting to me during the Celebrate St. Louis Festival during July 4th. I was amazed, frankly, they were able to get Warner Brothers sponsoring they did the big Superman drone show a week before Warner Brothers launched the video. Turns out that was a local resident who had a connection with Warner Brothers. But for her, they might not have sponsored that. That kind of connection can go a long way towards leading to the kinds of films and broadcast opportunities you're talking about. So I think we have just barely scratched the surface on what the potential is. We're going to serve the industry's needs locally. We're going to look for economic impact, but there's a larger potential of a brand lift for St. Louis. And when it goes back to the thought of how do we outsmart and outwork the competition, I think about those destinations we're competing with, Indianapolis and Columbus, for example. We should be able to compete in this space very, very well compared to them. And that's an opportunity to elevate St. Louis's profile and put us on a pedestal that we couldn't otherwise do with paid advertising.
And can I just say, sorry, I know you had other questions, but on leveraging some of the regional assets that we have, I do think it's really important, not just for film, but also for...
I'm sorry, Ms. Cox, I tweaked into your mic.
Yes,
Thank
sorry.
you.
I do just think it's important, not just for film, but also for some of that mid-scale programming. So I know you guys were mentioning sort of targeting some of those bigger events and bigger conventions from out of state. But regionally, I do think there's a lot of opportunities that we have that we could be leveraging as well. You mentioned, for example, one of the things we do well is sports and entertainment. I think about the cheerleading regional competitions or the dance regional competitions, where maybe we're not attracting people from very far away, but we're attracting people from Illinois, Arkansas that are coming in, parents that are maybe coming in and bringing their kids in from the county into downtown that could be booking hotels and adding to the economy that we have in downtown St. Louis. So I do just, I guess I'm curious about your mid-scale attraction plan for some of those like cheerleading, dance competitions that may not be big conventions, but they could utilize the rooms that we have in our convention.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned cheerleading and dance competitions. The single most resilient and arguably one of the most economic powerful streams of travel and tourism is youth sports for young females. Because when the sister is dancing or cheerleading, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, brothers, everybody shows up. The whole family's coming. They do not miss. Economic challenges, like I shared earlier, you might scale back on the family vacation. You might, cut the guy's golf getaway or the girlfriend getaway. Mom and dad will take out a second mortgage to make sure that 12-year-old does not miss the 12-year-old championship. They're coming to St. Louis. I think your point's well taken. We have a couple of positions within our sales team now that are specifically dedicated to those smaller groups. They tend to be the social, military, sports, fraternal group, not the big ones that we'll all celebrate and see, but every bit as important. And whether we can accommodate those in the midst of a larger convention like this week, or some of those can go to a Union Station, for example. It still fills restaurants and hotels. That has to be a part of our strategy. And Alderwoman, as you're probably aware, for every one of these big conferences, it's going to take 5 or 10 of those to have the extended impact that we want. I'm also very encouraged, and I give our Chief Commercial Officer, Ed Skapanak, a lot of credit for this. He initiated a position that's never existed at the CVC up until a couple months ago. We hired a local woman, a very talented local sales professional who's worked for a number of great institutions here, specifically to focus on what we call in the year for the year. Her goal is to fill those gaps, and it won't be filled with a conference like you see today, because that's going to be out years in advance. Her goal is to find those times when we need a little extra business and who's booking that. And the kinds of meetings you're talking about are the ones that will book within a 12 to 18 month period. Not that we haven't booked those before, we just haven't had anybody focused on them. So we now have somebody who wakes up every day and says, what can I do to move business in the next month, the next 6 months, the next 12 months? And I think that'll make us more effective at exactly what you're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Brad.
Can you, what is the name of the individual that was hired for the, in the year for the year?
Oh, Jill Method. And she worked for, you want to tell them a little bit about Jill?
Good morning, and Mr. Chairman, Jill Method is her name.
Do you mind, just for the public, stating your name and position with this?
My name is Ed Skapanak. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer with Explore St. Louis, and also a St. Louis City resident. Yes, so Jill Method is the individual that we hired. Love her background. She's brought a lot of energy to the team. She actually opened Ballpark Village doing event sales there, and then she also went to the Armory and opened that facility. It's not her fault that that facility sits in the situation it is today, but she did everything she could. She's been great. She's got a lot of local contacts. It's also been very effective about bringing contacts from out of the area. To your point, Alderwoman, that events that should be here in St. Louis could be here in St. Louis, and the strategy is to layer those around the larger events that obviously a lot of our team is focused on. But there's really great economic impact and benefit to having events like what Jill brings us.
Do you have other questions, Alderwoman?
Yes. The only other thing I had just really quickly, you're speaking about the marketing plan, which I think is very excellent and is going to be key to do a lot of the attraction that you talked about. I know food and dining came up a lot, and specifically for not only the residents, but the businesses that I have that are in the 8th Ward perimeter around the American One thing that's really important to them is making sure that their businesses are highlighted to the people that are coming to the America Center to do the things we talked about. So for the local domestic food and dining opportunity, maybe they're not a Union Station or not a highlighted business, Ballpark Village, let's say, but they are a traffic stop for the tourism that we're trying to attract. How is your marketing plan going to incorporate them?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, obviously the focus for us is to get their attention to St. Louis. But once we've got that attention, the primary tool we'll use are our social and digital channels, in particular our website. Candidly, our website needs some work. And so we've recently, one of those assessments I mentioned earlier was we went through an RFP process to select a company that's very skilled at digital marketing in our industry. They've taken a full assessment of all of our digital channels and our marketing spend. One of the questions we've asked them is, it's kind of a two-part question. One is, once we've got their attention, how do we make sure we drive them to the places in our ecosystem that will help them start to plan that vacation so they don't, I don't know about you, I've heard this many times from visitors, like, I had no idea, ... I had no idea, you had this restaurant, or I had no idea about this attraction. We've got to get better at telling that story before they come. At the same time, that website has to be mobile enabled and distributed in a way where they can consume it all throughout the journey. We want the brand to be present from the planning right to the departure. And so that will impact a lot of those businesses. The reality is when you're planning vacation, you may or may not select the restaurants you're going to eat at before you go. Some you will, some you won't. But we got to make it easy for them to select them here. I think we also have to extend that to the visitors at the Americas Center. We do have a restaurant concierge booth there, but we've got to be more digital enabled with that. So part of the strategy going forward is to amplify the message of not just why to come here, but what to do while you're here. We're also undertaking a really deep look at the partnership model that we use today. Basically, how do businesses engage with us? And my hope is that we can broaden the reach and the services we provide with a different model. I don't want to be the guy that comes in and has the know-it-all answers, but I think it's safe to say that we're not reaching enough segments of the visitor economy, and we aren't availing ourselves to enough opportunities that we can do precisely what you're talking about, which is do more and do better at marketing the restaurants, the attractions, particularly the startup businesses and the smaller businesses that don't have a big budget. So part of it's going to come from the better digital strategy. Part of it's going to become from a renewed or enhanced focus at the Americas Center and Dome. And then part of it, I think, is going to come from a better partnership model that will build on the strengths of what we have, but allow us to serve more businesses and engage with and through more businesses in the visitor economy. We can get to the point where every business as part of the visitor economy is officially on the Explore St. Louis team. We'll be better at serving your constituents, and your constituents will get more benefit out of us, and that's a win-win for all of us.
Thank you.
Just piggybacking off of some of what the Alderwoman asked, in terms of the kind of in the year, for the year, and short-term programming, more immediate kind of fill the gaps. Concerts and shows, just a casual observation. My partner is very much into music, concerts, things of that nature. It seems as though St. Louis isn't really getting as many concert bookings as Kansas City seems to really pop up a lot more lately, and even the Factory out in Chesterfield has been taking, I think, shows that otherwise would have been in the St. Louis. And so what can we do from a CVC perspective? I mean, I know Chesterfield's in your kind of footprint as well, but from a kind of Kansas City, Memphis, shows that are going to, let's be honest, much smaller markets. Kansas City and Memphis, aren't the same size regionally as St. Louis. St. Louis has a regional population of around 3 million people. If you count the 15 county, statistical area, we have a huge population here, and somehow we're missing out on some of these smaller opportunities that I don't think that concerts are usually booked out 3 years in advance. They're, probably more like a year or so as they're making plans. And so how can we maybe get in on the ground level with making sure that more of those shows are coming to St. Louis?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that. First off, I do think a number of the investments being made with that RAM settlement money I mentioned earlier through the RSA are designed to make the Dome a little more accommodating for concert goers. And that will mean a lot to like a Live Nation, because at the end of the day, they're going to have a limited number of venues. I don't know that that's going to bring more business here, but I think it's going to put us in a better position to close some of that business. I'm also encouraged, and I'm, of course, brand new to the CVC and brand new to St. Louis, but I understand from our team at the Americas Center and Dome that book concerts, the number of inquiries we've received for concerts over the next 12 to 14 months is substantially higher than what we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, inquiries don't do anything other than just take up some time to meet, right? We've got to close the business. But there seems to be some interest, at least from certain concert tours or promoters that are looking at us that either weren't looking at us before or maybe they were bypassing us for other reasons. But let me get right to the heart of your question, because clearly there's acts that are bypassing, going to cities that just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't be in St. Louis. One of the assessments I mentioned, I kind of blew through this quickly, but was a look at the Americas Center and the Dome. And the specific look at the Dome, and I want to be clear about this, this is not a rebuilding, planning, urban exploration project. It's simply one question. What is the best revenue optimization strategy for the Dome? What can we do to optimize revenues coming in and through the Dome, impacting the community? Is it more concerts? And to that point, is it positioning the Dome with some modifications to be able to accommodate a concert that's not going to sell 65,000 seats, but might sell 35,000 seats? What makes us more competitive in that realm? Now, to be clear, we're looking at that from a market standpoint. It makes no sense to try to invest money in the Dome to be more competitive with, the Enterprise Center or with, the Cardinal Stadium. But the venues here, certainly collectively and individually for us, could accommodate more. So I'll beg a bit on your question if I can get that study and then share that with you. That'll at least give us some insight as to what the opportunities are. I think that's a long sort of answer to a very important question. I think the more specific question, we're seeing some increased interest, but I think we've got to be a little more specific about our approach. We have to have a strategy on what we're going after, not just waiting to respond to those interested. And then we're going to use the expert's opinion on how do we position the Dome for increased revenue and impact in the community. Someday in this community, we're going to have a discussion about the highest and best use of that property. That's not for me to dictate, but we'll certainly be a part of that. When the community is ready, we'll be ready. But in the meantime, I'll share with you the same promise I made the board that hired me. I'm going to do everything I can to squeeze as much business that's good for our community into the Americas Center and the Dome, optimize their usefulness and their impact. And then as the market evolves and those facilities evolve, hopefully we'll be able to have a meaningful conversation about what do we do to bring these facilities to a point where they're serving the entire region optimally. In the short term, we're just going to try to do the best we can at utilizing those. And I think more concerts or different concerts may be a part of that strategy.
Yeah. Would Jill be responsible for kind of the short-term booking and engagement and
could be, yeah,
part of her
it
role?
Could be. Historically, that function has lived with the management of facilities. So we have a team that managed the Americas Center of the Dome. But I think the expectation was when we hired Jill's position is it won't just be for small meetings and events, although certainly a lot of that. But somebody's looking for a smaller performance venue, and they maybe aren't thinking about us reaching out to them and trying to initiate that. So yeah, it could be concerts or sporting events as well as meetings and conventions. The focus for her is just short-term business. And as you pointed out, most concerts aren't booked out, even when they're talking to us. In most instances, they're talking within the next 12 to 14 months. So we're not limiting her from doing that, but we also know that we've got to work with partners like Live Nation and Oakview Group. And if they want to bring different events, then we'll continue to work with them, and that would typically go through our facilities department. The reason I'm giving you both answers there is because right now that's the best strategy. But as we get the feedback back from the consultants, I think what you're going to see over the next few months is a more refined strategy, a little more buttoned up in terms of how we approach facilities management. That'll probably drive some structural changes and changes in roles and responsibilities. but we will not back off this notion that we have to have somebody, at least one person, if not more than focused on what do we do to move business quickly. And going back to the accountability chart I mentioned earlier, I think for us to serve you and your constituents well and our industry partners, we've got to be agile, nimble, and able to respond to those changes that don't happen over a period of years, they happen month to month.
So I'm just curious that would Jill or someone on the team be responsible for working with Live Nation, or other major ticketing operations, concert organizing operations, agencies to get that business into St. Louis? I'm not necessarily concerned about the Dome. I mean, that's a massive, 60,000 seat stadium. Most shows aren't going to be able to sell that out. Maybe Beyonce, folks of that caliber. But, we have shows for kind of the more small and mid tier that are bypassing St. Louis altogether as well. And while that might not be 60,000 people to fill the Dome, that is, 30,000 people that could go. I don't even know what the capacity is out at the factory, but I don't care if it's the factory or if it's Riverport Amphitheater or whatever they're calling that now, Hollywood Casino Amphitheater. I don't even know what iteration of the name they're on out there. But, that venue, or if it's a venue in the city, someone should be working with those, agencies and entities to be able to bring that book of business to St. Louis and selling them on St. Louis, telling them, the, population stats, the disposable income, the ages, et cetera, and trying to the demographic info to get them here, right? And so is that something that Jill or someone on your team is focused on doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. A couple other things. I know we have a HUD's hearing at 11, so you'll be out of here in a minute. But we have, on one of the slides that you showed, you talked about the opportunity and that we only have 8% of the market share for I think it was professional conventions, science related, and then also medical professionals, things of that nature. You and I had a conversation not too long ago talking about just the industry and economic base here in St. Louis as a region, and some of those are missed opportunities in my mind as well. St. Louis is one of the largest hubs for financial services in the country. Outside of New York and Charlotte, St. Louis is probably third, maybe fourth in comparison to Chicago in some respects. But in terms of mortgages, banking, securities, we've got Wells Fargo Advisors, we've got Stifel. I think we have more Series 7, Series 9s issued in St. Louis than anywhere except New York. And so that's a huge, opportunity that I feel like we're probably, needing to tackle. I know Stifel has their annual shareholder meeting here in the city, brings several thousand people into our town. But, there's other industries like auto manufacturing, aerospace, Boeing, beverages and brewing. I mean, certainly AB InBev is a huge name in that industry. But also we have, ag. The ag business, is a major economic contributor here in the city or in the region. And then also logistics and warehousing is another kind of, as more companies like Amazon come online and deal with logistics and warehousing, all of those industries have conventions. I know, I've been to some of them. And so is that part of more the mid and long-term strategy? And I know you and I talked about it a couple months back, but how is the team kind of retooling to trying to address some of the more, I think you and I talked about horizontal versus, vertical marketing strategies. And so, can you talk a little bit about how the team might be retooling to address some of those?
Sure. I'm learning whatever I say to you, you remember months later. So I'll to be mindful of this. This is good. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If we're going to turn those numbers around, and particularly if we're going to penetrate those top two sectors that just don't perform as well in now, it's going to take a village, so to speak. And I'm encouraged. There was a great example recently, a local businessman named Paul Larson. I think his business is located on Broadway, if I'm not mistaken. He got very, very involved with an association that he's familiar with, he's engaged with, and he is the big reason why they're bringing a convention that could potentially bring thousands of young professionals to St. Louis at a time when we would otherwise be very, very dead. And I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say that because of that one local resident who came to us and said, I want to help, let's do this, we're going to get a really nice boost from a piece of business in early January that it will start out at just 3,500 room nights, but it could be multiples of that within the first couple of years. That's a great example of where the CVC engaging with a local resident can make it happen, because if it was up to us, we would not have gotten that. It was his expertise and his connections. I'm encouraged also when I look at what Greater St. Louis has done with a committee or a council that they've formed of local corporate leaders in some of the companies you just mentioned. We're helping them identify leads. Now, Greater St. Louis's focus is bringing those companies here. We just want to bring their meetings here. And so we're going to follow that same path. And I would put it as a short-term strategy that will have mid-term, long-term results. And the goal is to work with those corporate partners and associations to figure out, like, what are those opportunities that are perfectly attuned to St. Louis? Agriculture is one. Health and medical is certainly another, and we could go through the list. And if you think about all just the professors in academia here, they're all traveling to meetings. Why not get those meetings here? Those ag conferences that are going to California and Florida and other places could rightfully be here. And so I think a local integrated strategy will help us with that, but I think it's got to be something formalized. I think we have to do a good job at engaging those locals who have the connections and the expertise and helping pull that in. So that is definitely going to be a strategy going forward. It aligns closely with the redeployment of the sales that I mentioned earlier. So historically, the CVC has organized its sales team geographically, which means if you were going to book a piece of business, the first question we'd ask is, well, where's your office? Where do you work out of? That was relevant 20 years ago, but in today's environment where somebody could, live in St. Louis and technically work in London or vice versa, that geography question just doesn't matter anymore. So what we've got to do is align with vertical segments, which we've now done. So now when we want to go after the aerospace industry, we have one person who specializes in aerospace industry meetings. That's the person that we need to connect with the local leaders in the aerospace segment, figure out what are the meetings that make sense to have here, or are there meetings that don't exist that could be created here, and how do we specifically target their needs? Having a sales team that's deployed by vertical as opposed to geographic makes it a lot easier to engage our community. We still have to make the connections there, but I think there's an opportunity for us to empower local residents who want to help us bring more business here to do precisely that. So it's an important priority in the short term. It won't yield a lot of results in 2026 or 2027, but it's going to help prepare us to grow those numbers over the next several years.
Yeah, I don't want to gloss over the 2026 outlook either. And you and I have had this conversation as well, and I've mentioned it in other committee hearings. But there's several hotels in the St. Louis City marketplace that are going into receivership or already in receivership, and so I think the CVC can help play a major role in getting business into the region and to the city to help support businesses at those hotels. Some have already announced, closures, et cetera. And I keep getting feedback about others that might be, coming down the pipe. And so I just want to make sure that, we are sensitive to the gap that's ahead of us, and, trying to get that, in the year, for the year. And so I've mentioned Jill's name a couple of times. Please, pass along my sincerest apologies. I'm not trying to put her, on the spot here, but I think she's got a pretty big job ahead of her for, the 2026 calendar year, and helping to support that, the business community and the tourism community here to make sure that we, don't suffer some major losses that we can't recover from down the line.
I certainly align with that, acknowledge that, and I should also reiterate, Mr. Chairman, the charts earlier that showed how we performed well this year, those are averages. That doesn't mean everybody's performing well. Right. So there are winners and there are losers, and I think at the CVC, we can't get too comfortable even when we see charts like that. In a down environment, they might be filling up a hotel, but they're not eating in the restaurants, they're not going to the attractions. Businesses here are feeling the impact. So
Right.
you can't get too comfortable even when those charts look positive. And I hope you take away from today that we're being candid about what's working and what's not. We're being honest and transparent about the challenges ahead. But I hope I've made it clear, we're not just sitting back and taking next 2 years as a down year. We just have to recognize that we can't determine, as the old saying goes, we can't determine the direction of the wind, but we can adjust our sails. We're going to have to adjust our sails and try it a little differently over the next couple of years if we're going to deliver success. And that's what you deserve and expect. That's what your constituents need, and that's what we.
And I have two other things. One, we talked about during your presentation, the kind of glimmer of hope that younger generations are really, enjoying St. Louis, want to visit St. Louis, et cetera. How are we targeting that market segment? Are we going, because, I'm not on TikTok, but, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, they all have advertisements. And I've seen the advertisements for places like, Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, et cetera. Vegas, it always pops up. I'm not even a gambler. I'm not sure why they target me so. But are we doing something similar? I know I wouldn't necessarily see them as a St. Louis, but do we do those types of targeted marketing, campaigns that will hopefully connect with those, younger tourists and the dollars they'll bring into our region?
Indeed. We're on all of those channels you mentioned, as well as, of course, Meta. Instagram is big, and that generation, that's how they consume, that's how they plan, that's how they communicate. And that's part of the reason for that emphasis on digital. It's not that we haven't been on digital channels, but that's going to be almost the sole delivery of our messaging in terms of paid advertising, and in many cases, earned media. And so, I think what you'll see in 2026 is a greater emphasis on those younger travelers, in part because they are in many instances looking for the more affordable opportunities, also in part because the brand tells us that they align with what we have. And the younger generation of travelers, and by younger we're talking in that chart I presented, by under 35, they tend to consider travel as a bit of a birthright. It's something that they expect, they enjoy, and they'll do it on their terms, and they'll do it in ways and shape and form and places they choose. But they are maybe a little less likely than other generations to give up the travel privilege when the economy is slower. And so we believe that's a growth opportunity for us. We're not foregoing other generations. We're not only going to promote to the younger generation, but that increased emphasis on digital marketing and a greater alignment with those brand attributes I shared earlier, I think will position us well to capture more of the younger travelers in the region, and that can be a good lift in the short term.
And then the last thing I want to, ask some questions about, which was also the last part of your presentation, is the convention center and the, expansion of the ballroom space, or expansion of the convention space, the exhibit space, and then just where we're at. You mentioned 86% of the investment is completed. I know that the kind of docks on the rear are complete, or at least they look complete the last time I went back there. The exhibit halls have been, built out. And you mentioned the Washington Avenue and adjoining entrance. So that would be on the on the west side, on the southwest corner of the building, which I believe there was also supposed to be a park that was built in that space as well. And you mentioned a fence in a parking lot. So can you maybe talk about that? And because that seems to be different than what we have heard in the past.
So the as I understand it, the original concept was there would be a ballroom on that side. I'm directionally challenged. That would be
the convention center entrance is on the south side, and then the side with the river is the east side. So it would be the southwest.
Oh, but the 9th Street side of the convention center.
So Washington and 9th would be southwest corner.
I think the initial thought was you'd have this ballroom where you'd have these big keynote type presentations and major events, and then you have this outdoor space to kind of naturally flow out to, and people could use that for breaks and congregating and the things you do when you're in between there. That all changed when the ballroom plan was canceled. There is no new ballroom. So the ballroom is on the 7th Street side of the building. And of course, to give you an idea, our ballroom on the 7th Street side of the building has about 1/4 of the space of Columbus, Ohio. So when we're competing for business, they have 3 ballrooms, we have 1, and our space is about 1/4 of what they offer. So we're pretty constrained
That's
as
the ballroom on the second floor.
correct, correct. So if you think about that original plan, you would have to leave the 2nd floor on 7th Street, walk all the way through the building and these massive exhibit halls, which may or may not be in use for all groups, to get to a park on the 9th Street. It became no longer necessary. And I believe the coordination team that met, the team appointed by Mayor Spencer, looked at this and recognized that the original concept just didn't make sense. But the residents of that area needed a solution, a remedy, because the parking lot of the asphalt was torn up. It was unsafe. It was unsightly. And I'll just say, as a resident down there, I've heard it, I've seen it, I've observed it. They needed a resolution. It wasn't fair to the residents to have to look at that and deal with that every day. And it was becoming a bit of a safety hazard as well. So when the coordination team met, they said, let's go ahead and just pave that. I realize that surface parking may not be the most popular topic in St. Louis, but as at least an interim solution, it will give us some added parking, which we need. It will be fenced. It will be lighted. I understand there'll be cameras there, electric vehicle charging, and I think there'll be some trees around it. I know your colleague, Alderwoman Cox-Antwi, made it very clear to me that that was not her idealistic use for that property. I think Alderman Aldridge has also expressed that. But as we found with the America Center expansion, sometimes we got to live with what we can do, not necessarily what we want to do. And so realistically, is that the highest and best use of that property? No. And when you look at some of the surrounding properties, could that become something more, something different, something better? Certainly, I think that door is open. But for the interim, it will become a surface parking lot, which will at least make it safer. It will make it less unsightly and address some of the parking challenges that we experience today. And hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be talking about development around the America Center, and that parcel could certainly play a role into what it could be in the future.
So what would it take to continue the conversation around the ballroom on essentially putting a ballroom on the first floor of the convention center? Do we have estimates in terms of, the cost of that? And are we having conversations around that? I remember, this has been many years that we've been getting feedback, some of the items that are left outstanding here, the kitchen modernization, that's one of the things that I thought would have been at the top of the list, even before, staging and, deliveries in the rear, because we continually get feedback about the food quality at the convention center, because they have to walk a mile after the food is cooked to put it in a ballroom facility. And that's hardly an exaggeration. You've got food being cooked in a basement kitchen and then, walked literally, several blocks and up an elevator and then sitting outside of a ballroom before it gets delivered to a table. And so, it obviously has an impact on the business that we can get, because people don't always have the best experience, in terms of the food there. And so, not that it hasn't been a lovely rubber chicken dinner circuit, anytime I go there, but, it does have an impact on the, book of business as well. And so, what are the costs that were expected? When are those going to get prioritized? Are we having the conversation with the administration around getting those projects completed?
Yeah. So we have had conversations with, private sector partners and those who are helping us manage the facility, particularly Levy, that manages the food and beverage, who would opine that you have just spoken correctly on the challenges. We're seeing it this week. And also our hotel partners and others. We have not initiated conversations with the administration, with this board, or with the county. And if I'm remiss in doing that, by all means, we will rectify that quickly. Mr. Chairman, I've taken the simple approach that you made a bold investment in that facility and indirectly in our organization, and we need to deliver on the promise we made, which is to dutifully invest those funds as best we can and deliver the best results possible. And so my focus right now is bringing the results up to speed and closing out that account, making sure that the remaining funds are spent in prudent fashion. And then at some point, I hope sooner rather than later, to have a meaningful conversation about the future of the America Center and the Dome. You know, one of the most interesting conversations I had over the past month was with Bob Clark. And I didn't know Bob Clark. I'd heard what everybody thought of Bob Clark. And when I sat down with him, making a pretty compelling vision of what St. Louis could be, not just in terms of meetings and conventions, and left me with more hope and optimism than it did pessimism. But specifically to your question, we haven't initiated those conversations. I suspect we're looking at a 9-figure number, low 9 figures, and it's going to require some retrofitting of that facility if we're talking about the existing facility. So it's a broader conversation we need to have, but my thought is until the mayor or the Board of Aldermen tell me differently, I'm going to do the best I can with what we've got. We're going to close out that account. We're going to be accountable and transparent with where those funds are going. We're going to do the best we can to turn the dour forecast into a better forecast. And when we're ready, sooner or later, I hope sooner, we'll be ready to have that conversation with you and others about where do we go. But for now, I'm going to do the best I can at investing what you've entrusted with us, landing this plane, so to speak, and putting us in the best position to capture business we can, albeit recognizing that the facility we have today, even with that expansion, is leaving us in an unfortunate competitive disadvantage that won't go away on its own.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much. And just one final ask. In the past, we've done some tours of the facility as it's been under construction. So, I mean, if it's something that you're amenable, I can try and arrange kind of updated tour of the facilities for the Board of Aldermen so that members are able to, firsthand experience, what the, new updates look like, and also, what the challenges and opportunities are for, future growth and expansion of the convention center as well.
We would welcome that. I know your schedules are incredibly busy, but we would welcome the opportunity to host you and your colleagues at the America Center and the Dome and let you see what you've invested in and also have a candid discussion about the next opportunities.
That would be great. I will be happy to work with you in your office on getting that scheduled. And then do you have any other questions, Alderwoman?
Questions from
And that was the only item on our agenda today. So, thank you again for coming down here, and look forward to continuing working together, and very much appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, I think I've been taking notes on my agenda. Nope.
Any written announcements?
I just want, in terms of announcements, can we make sure that a TNC meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 a.m.? And can you also excuse the Alderman from the 1st and the Alderman from the 4th for necessary absence? And with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn until next Tuesday at 9 a.m.
Second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. We stand adjourned.